thank you, Pat. That was lovely. You did the short version, which is always less objectionable. Oh, I have to get to the, did I start talking before you were ready?
It's okay.
It's okay. All right, all right. And this is good? This is good? Okay.
Can everybody hear?
Yeah, okay. I'm always pleased to get an invitation from the library because I owe my soul to libraries. For the last 30 years, I've used them mostly to research my biographies, which means I'm usually up to my elbows in diaries and letters and other old documents. And I've done this work in research libraries across the country and the British National Archives and the French Diplomatic Archives. And it's really a joy to work in these places. You sit around and you read other people's mail. There's the no cell phone rule means that nobody can bother you for the whole time you're in there. It's wonderful. It's like taking your mind to a spa. But as wonderful as these places are, none of them has been as magical as my first trip to the library. And I was thinking as I was coming in that I always, even now, I'm like about to be 72 years old. My first trip to the library was when I was 6. And like even now, every time I walk into a library, I get a thrill. I mean, a genuine thrill. And it's kind of the opposite of PTSD, you know, where you go on having terrible experiences and flashbacks. This is like a really positive, I don't know what we would call it, but just a burst of pleasure that goes straight back to that early memory of discovering the library. And what happened on that day, I lived in a little town way up in northern Michigan. It's the same latitude as Caribou, Maine, and it would kind of remind you of a lot of small towns in Maine. And from the time you were 3, you'd wander around by yourself because everybody knew whose child you were. So nothing could go wrong, and nothing did go wrong as far as I knew. So it was my summer between 1st and 2nd grade, and I was on the little downtown, and I saw this book bag in the window of this office supply store, and it was fake alligator. It was green, and it had red plastic trim and a red plastic handle. And I went in, and it cost $3.98. I didn't have much sense of what money was, but I was afraid that was a lot of money, and my parents wouldn't want me to have it. So I was like thinking about how I was going to tell them that I would have this book bag for, you know, all the way through high school. They would never have to buy me another book bag. And so $3.98 over all those years would turn out to be not very much money. So I'm walking home on the main street, and I see this storefront with lots of books in the window, and I think, oh, this is a bookstore. And there were some books in my house, but not a lot. And I went in just to kind of see what a bookstore was. I had never been in one. And I'm walking around, and there were these, you know, shelves and just books and books and books and books all in one big room. And I went over, there was this woman sitting at a desk in the back, and I went over to her and I said, well, how do you know how much the books cost? And she explained to me what a library was. And that just blew my mind, the fact that you could borrow, you know, that all these books were there and that anyone could borrow them. But I thought it was probably something just grown-ups could do. So I was plotting about how to get my mother to bring me back here and we could borrow some books. And my mother, by the way, was a school teacher, and you'd think she would be in the library all the time, but my father worked on a ship on the Great Lakes, so he was never home. So she's there with 3 children and at this point expecting a 4th. So she didn't have time to go to the library. It was one of many things she didn't have time to do. So anyway, the librarian said, would you like a library card? And it was fountain pen days still, in that part of the world at least. So I stood there waiting for her to write out my library card in fountain pen and wait for the ink to dry. I can still picture it. It was a little orange card, and my number was 1221. Sorry I don't have it anymore, because I'd certainly show it to you this morning. And that library card was my passport to the universe. I mean, this town is like very remote, and without the library, I don't know how I would have learned about the rest of the world except for the things they teach you in school, but I actually didn't like school very much. That library just meant the world to me when I was a little kid, and I've since learned that libraries can mean many, many things to children, and I'm sure Pat and her colleagues here could give you lots of examples, but I'm going to confine myself to one. And I usually cry when I tell this story, so prepare yourself for old faucet face here. I had a friend who was a librarian in a private school in the suburbs of Detroit, and there was a little boy who was about 7, and his father died. And everyone in the school, everyone on the staff knew this. And he came into the library one day, and kind of with his head down, he said, do you have any books about when someone in your family dies? And she said yes, and she didn't ask him anything or didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge that she knew what his situation was. She just took him over to where such books were, and then he got some and checked them out. And when he brought them back, he said, "Thank you for not asking." So, I mean, it's just, to me, this is just a beautiful story about the confusions of being a child and not knowing what to do, not, even knowing how to ask questions necessarily, or maybe thinking in that situation, my mother is too busy with other things and too sad, and so he thinks to read about it in the library. So I think that, and I've heard since many stories along those lines, and they always touch me, and it just makes me think that if you become on easy terms with the library when you're a little kid, you'll never be lonesome in your life. You'll always have a place to go, and you'll always have this tribe, the librarians, who can help you find things without invading your tenderest, most private feelings. So I'm here out of my love of libraries, and I'm guessing that some of you are here for the same reason, and I hope that all of you, I love introducing little kids to libraries. I usually do it if they have newspapers on microfilm. I take them to a reel of microfilm from when they were born, and then they get hooked on seeing what was happening on, I always think little kids' history should be taught backwards anyway, so that they can start with when they were born and then go back from there. So thank you for coming, especially on a precious Maine summer morning to spend some time here with me. And I'm going to take you on a walk back to some August mornings 100 years ago in northern France and here in New England. This is a war story, of course, because it's August 1918. And the main characters in my story anyway are faceless armies and a petrified German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, a petrified German general, Erich Ludendorff, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, and his confidential advisor, Edward M. House, better known as Colonel House. The war, at this point in August, there's the Kaiser now, calling from the defense. And at this point, the war has finally turned against the Germans. There was a big rout on July 15th, and it just kept on going. So on August 8th, to be like last week, 100 years ago, after a string of defeats and the opening of an especially punishing assault near the city of Amiens in northern France, General Ludendorff understood that Germany couldn't win. And he would always remember August 8th as the Black Day for the German army in World War I. But the British immortalized it as the start of the 100 Days Offensive, which was the drive that ended the war. And this drive, there's finally coordinated fire from planes and tanks and infantry. And with this, the British were able to break through lines that had previously been impenetrable, where the German defenses had basically held since 1914 and 1915. So the Battle of Amiens marked the end of nearly 4 years of trench warfare where it was just a standoff. So from then on till the armistice on November 11th, the fighting was done on the move, with the Germans in retreat and the Allies and the American Expeditionary Force at their heels all along the Western Front. Well, the Kaiser couldn't understand what had gone wrong, you know, why the German army was at this point failing, and he blamed the army, and he said, after the first day of the Battle of Amiens, he said to his companions, "It's very strange that our men cannot get used to tanks." Tanks were introduced in the war in 1918. So Ludendorff didn't blame the army, he blamed the German people who were turning against the war in droves, and so were the soldiers. 17,000 of them surrendered after the first day of the Battle of Amiens. I mean, just think of that they would rather surrender to the enemy than try to slug it out. And did any of you ever see an old movie, I think it was made during World War II, about Sergeant York?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I remember there's a scene where he's coming back to camp with all these prisoners, and there are like 209 of them or something. And as a child, I wondered, like, well, how could one guy, you know, against 209? And they didn't tell you in the movie that those soldiers had surrendered. You know, I couldn't figure out in the movie what was going on, which I think was intentional. You were just supposed to think he was quite a guy. So that's what was happening. There were all these thousands and thousands of soldiers surrendering. And the Kaiser's depressed. He's having trouble falling asleep, and when he sleeps, he has nightmares, and the nightmares about, you know, he's related to all the royalty of Europe. And in his nightmares, all his cousins are parading past him and laughing at him, mocking him, which seems just perfect. And Ludendorff was also perturbed, and he was having trouble sleeping, and a psychologist advised him to just get more sleep, which, you know, if you're really upset, is a hard thing to hear. It's like, don't be afraid of the dark. Like, it's not helpful advice. But he had another suggestion, too, which was that when Ludendorff got up in the morning, he should buck himself up by singing German folk songs. So I don't know if he did that, but it didn't work in any case. And the other thing that's going on is the German foreign minister has been given permission to open confidential talks with somebody in a neutral country to see if they can get a peace conference going. If the Germans can propose a peace conference before the Allies get to that point, they might make a better deal than if they actually lost the war. So, and the other thing that's happening is the Emperor of Austria, and Austria is Germany's chief ally in the war, he turns up at the Kaiser's headquarters to say that he wants to quit the war. And I remember reading about the origins of World War I, I mean the immediate things that led up to the first shots being fired in the last couple of weeks before that started. And it is so confusing. I heard the great military historian John Keegan give a talk about this, and in the question and answer period someone said, "How did this all get started?" And he said, "Oh, madam, I would have to go back to my notes to be able to tell you that, because it's a series of very small moves where things are going wronger and wronger and wronger, and then this big explosion." So anyway, August 1918 is very black days indeed for the German army. And while all this is going on in Europe, President Wilson is on the presidential yacht Mayflower. He's cruising up to the seaside town of Magnolia, Massachusetts on the North Shore. His friend Colonel House summered there, and the two men were getting together to discuss the peacemaking that would come at the end of the war. The president is bubbling over with ideas, and his ideas are making House very uneasy. For one thing, Wilson wanted to attend the peace conference, which was likely to be in Europe. So in those days, you have to go to Europe on a ship. The peace conference was going to take a very long time because it had been a very complicated war. And so, you know, that meant the President of the United States was going to be out of the country for months. This had never happened before. And House was worried about what Americans would think about it and how that might affect things politically if the President is gone for several months. And for another thing, Wilson was talking about appointing a commission to go with him to the peace conference. And he hadn't decided who he wanted to appoint, but he had decided who wouldn't serve. So House said, well, you're going to have a leading Republican on this commission. That's the tradition when a peace commission goes overseas to negotiate a treaty. You have people from both parties on the commission. Wilson was an extremely partisan president. And House said, you have three really strong choices here that Republicans would admire. There's former President Theodore Roosevelt, there's former President William Howard Taft, and then there's former Secretary of State Elihu Root. All these guys were really knowledgeable about international affairs. And Wilson just flatly rejected all of them. House and Wilson also had a troubling conversation about Wilson's great dream for the post-war world, which was a League of Nations. And House had drafted a covenant for the League at Wilson's request, and Wilson had edited it, and now they thought they were pretty close to having a plan that Wilson could present to the peace conference. And Wilson wanted to keep this under lock and key. He didn't want anyone to know what he had in mind. That's one way to do things, but it turned out to be a really big mistake. I think the reason was made, I mean, sometimes you don't have facts about things, you need to speculate, and you speculate on the basis of everything that you know by the time you're sitting down to write the book. And I would say that the reason they kept it secret was House was the kind of guy who liked to be in on a secret. He just loved talking to people and not showing all his cards, and he talked to everybody. So, and sometimes he leaked, but mostly he didn't. He just liked hugging this secret information close. And Wilson, I think, did it because Wilson had quite a hard time with opposition. He did not. Nobody likes opposition, but you know, if you get all the way to the presidency of the United States, you should have a few tricks up your sleeve about dealing with it. And some people are very good about just confronting it openly. I've been told that both LBJ and Clinton, if they came into a party in Georgetown, say, and it was full of journalists, and 9 out of the 10 journalists there had written positive articles in that day's paper about the president, both Clinton and both LBJ would go to the one who'd been critical and try to romance him. And I think that's like a really good, for certain, I would have a hard time doing that, but I think it's a really good quality in a leader. And Wilson, he just would not like to do this. He avoided opposition whenever he could. Didn't want anybody finding fault with his plan, and it just doesn't seem to have occurred to him, as far as I could find in the record, that people they might not be coming out with their dukes up, they might actually have constructive suggestions and suggestions about things that he hadn't thought of. But it was just, you know, talking to the people on the other side was just always a negative experience for him. And House also was worried about, in Wilson's plan, Republicans actually had heard of this League of Nations because Wilson had given a couple of speeches about it. It was kind of vague, but they had put out their ideas that in an organization like this, it wouldn't do. Wilson was talking about having an organization where every member was on an equal footing, the big countries and the small countries alike. And the big countries objected to this, not so much, I think, because they enjoyed shoving the small countries around, but if there was going to be a war, these were the countries who had big armies and navies and would be called upon to contribute. So they thought they should have a larger say in any decisions that had to do with war and peace. And so Wilson, House is bringing this problem up with Wilson, and Wilson is saying, well, that doesn't square with the speeches that I've been giving, advocating a world order based on equality of nations. And House persisted for another round. Sometimes he did this and sometimes he didn't. And Wilson cracked a little bit. He wondered if it would be possible to reach equality in a gradual way. Maybe you could found a league big nations first and then sort of gradually add members. House didn't take that idea any further. He just let it go and crossed his fingers and hoped that the great powers statesmen that Wilson would be dealing with at the peace conference would be able to get him to change his mind. And so I've told you about this anecdote just to give you a sense of the partnership of these two men, but it might not be enough to get you all the way to the conclusion that I have about this, because my conclusion is based on many things that come before in the book. So I just have to ask you to bear with me, because I've been watching them in action over several years of their lives, many years of my life. And you know, Shelby Foote, the great Civil War historian, he spent 20 years writing his multi-volume history of the Civil War, and somebody said to him, "Shelby, the war only took 4 years, you took 20 years. What's the deal?" And he said, "There were so many more of them than there are of me." And I had times of feeling like that with Wilson. Anyway, Wilson knew that the Republicans were going to raise objections to the treaty, and he would bring back. And it's the Senate who has to approve a treaty by a 2/3 majority, and he just wouldn't talk to them and get their advice and kind of like get their buy-in on at least some of what he was trying to do. And House was just all too willing to let somebody else, you know, tackle Wilson on this big issue. And this portends a lot of trouble for Wilson, both when he goes to the Paris Peace Conference and when he comes home with the treaty. But now we're going to go back to France for a little bit. So the Germans are no longer on the attack, they're retreating, but they didn't just turn and run at high speed. They fought really hard to slow the Allied advance. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Meuse-Argonne region in northeastern France. It's not a very touristy part of France. It's kind of barren, and it got totally wrecked in World War I and World War II, and it sort of looks like that. I mean, you're not seeing rubble anymore, but there's just a whole lot of empty spaces where there ought to be like small farm as there is in southern France. And the Meuse-Argonne region in northeastern France is where the Americans did most of their fighting. And there's a long series of high hills up there, and the Germans had commanded these heights since the first months of the war, and their task was to capture the heights. The Americans were, in effect, fish in a barrel. They had to just be climbing up as all this machine gun fire is raining down on them. I spent some time walking around the bottom reaches of these heights, but not as much as I thought I would. I mean, it was just sickening to be in that landscape and think about like being a soldier trying to get up under fire. The largest American military cemetery in France is not in Normandy. It's in this part of France. When you know about the fighting, you know why. So Wilson is following the fighting very closely, but in the days before transatlantic flights, he can't go visit the troops. His style as a commander-in-chief is to give, to choose a general and allow him and the Secretary of War and the War Department to run the war as they see fit, and then he backed them to the hilt. And the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, but it wasn't one of the Allies. It preferred to call itself an associate, as did several other countries, because Wilson wanted an arm's length relationship with the Allies. He thought it would give him more flexibility in negotiating the peace, and he also didn't want to be, he had a lot of problems with decisions that they made in fighting the war and their unwillingness to, he offered to mediate a couple of times, and they didn't want anything to do with that. Both sides just thought if they hung on, they could win. So Wilson's offers were spurned. And also, he had in mind that if the United States fought as an independent force, then its battlefield contributions would be recognized in a way that they wouldn't be if they were just folded into the French army and the British army. You know, those would then be called like either Allied victories or British victories or French victories, but the Americans wouldn't get full credit for what they had done. So they're cooperating with the Allies, but they're, you know, thinking ahead to how all of this is going to be portrayed, and they're very sensitive about all of this. And there's an extra reason for the sensitivity, which is the Americans didn't enter the war. The war starts in 1914. The Americans didn't enter until the spring of 1917. And by the time they get their troops over there, it's the fall, and there's no fighting in the winter in the war. They're just kind of waiting for the spring offensive. So the Americans are not making their big contribution until starting in the spring of 1918. And there's a joke about a Yank and a Brit meeting up, and the Yanks have on their brass buttons on their uniforms AEF for American Expeditionary Force. And the Brit says, "Oh, after everything's finished." And the Yank says, "No, it's after England failed." You could tell that, if you were British, you could tell that joke the other way. It was a touchy point, and still is among historians. So the big question is, did the Americans coming so late actually make a difference? And the answer is yes, because there were 2 million of them on the ground in France when the fighting started in the spring of 1918. And they were fresh, and all the other troops their ranks were seriously depleted, and their morale was really low, and they're just totally exhausted. So you have these young, fresh-faced soldiers and Marines who really, really did, and there were so many of them, they really did make a difference. Wilson had been a boy in the South during the Civil War. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and sometimes in the churchyard there were Yankee prisoners. It was used as kind of a stockade. And sometimes in a corner of the church there was a little hospital for Confederate soldiers, and his mother tended soldiers and wounded soldiers. His father was a chaplain one summer in the Confederate Army. And the family, shortly after the Civil War, moves to Columbia, South Carolina, which was one of the cities burned by General Sherman. And it's just this charred wreck. If you ever see pictures of it, it's just like everything is blackened. So Wilson saw all of that, and in Columbia, he's a little older. He's, you know, in his early teens, and the town, so he can walk around a little bit, and he sees emancipated slaves who have no work and are just kind of sitting around, and former Confederate soldiers who have nothing to wear but their old uniforms, who are also unemployed and just sitting around. So it's a dismal time, and the whole experience made a pacifist out of Woodrow Wilson. And from the opening days of the World War, he really did try to offer his services as a mediator, but as I said before, everybody refused. So he also did everything he could think of to keep the United States out of the war. But what happened in February 1917, the Germans had been using submarines. The other navies had submarines a little bit by this point, but the Germans were way ahead of everybody on this. And they were sinking all kinds of ships, and Wilson got them to stop sinking for a while, to stop sinking civilian ships, passenger ships in particular. But all these freighters are going, you know, England is basically cut off. So everybody's taking, and Germany too, there's a blockade of the North Sea. This is actually a story, great World War I story that somebody could make a movie about, a documentary. The two sides are trying to starve each other into submission. The Germans with their submarines cutting off Britain, and the British Navy up in the North Sea with a blockade of ports up there so that no supplies can get into Germany by sea. Everybody had ways around this, but it was a very situation. And in February, very terrible situation. More people died in Germany of starvation in World War I than died from the fire bombings, the Allied fire bombings of Germany in World War II. It's like as many as 700,000 people. So Wilson is not only trying to get the belligerents to negotiate, he's trying to keep the United States out of the war. But in February 1917, the Germans announced that what they called unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning they could shoot at anything. They weren't going to care if it was a passenger ship or what, or a ship from a neutral country or what. So Wilson decides he has to either go to war, declare war, or the United States is going to get dragged into it. So he first severs relations with Germany, and 2 months later he asks for a declaration of war. And as you probably remember from high school, he said that the United States was entering the fight not to enlarge its territory or for other material gains, but because the world must be made safe for democracy. And that became a rallying cry, at least in the United States. And it was a big deal in the, many of the countries that we now think of as in Eastern Europe. The separate countries were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so the World War I for them was a war of independence. So they greatly admired this notion that the world must be made safe for democracy, and their representatives were turning up in Washington to find out how to get a republic up and running once the war was over and the empires were ended. So Wilson, basically from the beginning of the war, he's following what's going on in the war, especially once the Americans get in. But he's really always from the beginning cared more about the peace and what the world is going to be like after this. This is the first global war, and he saw the horrors from the beginning and wanted there never ever to be a sequel. So the shooting stops on November 11th, and the armistice goes into effect. And you'd think that Woodrow Wilson would be jumping up and down because it's finally time to get down to the business of peace. But for one thing, Wilson never jumped up and down. He was kind of a subdued individual. And for another thing, he's relieved that the war is over, but the United States had just had the midterm elections of 1918. I mean, here we are biting our nails about another one midterm. And what happened in these elections was he had majorities in the House and the Senate for 6 years. So he had his way about just about everything. And now he's not going to get his way anymore because the Republicans won both houses of Congress, and he's a minority president. So a week before the election, he had infuriated the Republicans by just sending out an announcement that everybody should vote Democratic because he was going to have to negotiate the peace, and he had to have a united country behind him if he was going to have any swat with these leaders in Europe. And the Republicans were, I think, justifiably angry about this because they had been more supportive of a lot of, like, first the buildup of the Army and the Navy than Democrats had been, and they supported all his war measures and the money-raising measures and everything else. So they felt really slapped in the face by Wilson doing this. So now he's, he's got to face opposition, which he doesn't like. So you'd think he would be a little, just craft your own message after a defeat like this, and you're still the president. You'd probably be talking about, there are times to put partisanship aside, and this is one of them, and we all have to collaborate, and America does great things when both parties, etc. But he doesn't do this. He's defiant. He says that he's the only federal official elected by all the people. He's going to be president for another 28 months. The Constitution assigns the conduct of foreign relations to the president, and he intended to exercise his presidential powers to the full. So he's in fighting mode at this point. And then he adds insult to injury by failing to appoint a prominent Republican to his peace commission. He appointed a very nice man who had been an ambassador but was long retired, and he didn't have any real standing in the party. He wasn't, you couldn't call him a Republican leader by any stretch. then he's getting ready, he's got some time to get ready before he leaves for the peace conference that is decided is going to be in Paris, and he's got some time before he leaves, and you'd think he might be inviting in the foreign affairs committees of both the House and the Senate to ask for suggestions. I mean, how hard is that? But he doesn't do it. He's just like holding all of this close. The long and short of it is that he got almost no cooperation from Congress, from either the House or the Senate after this point. I called my book The Moralist because Wilson was a president who passionately cared about being on the high road. And in fact, when he took the low road, which he did a few times, he sometimes fell physically ill. But when he ran into stiff opposition after the midterms, what happened to his moral principles is that they hardened into moral superiority. It's really, really painful to watch because he's basically a good guy he didn't know when to like give in. You know, he thought if he just fought hard, always he could prevail. This morality, which he has used to very good effect in his domestic policy, becomes moral vanity, really. And he doesn't seem to have, that I could tell anyway, any awareness of that. If you've ever read about the Paris Peace Conference, you might remember that the economist John Maynard Keynes, who was then a British Treasury official, wrote a memorable book in which he cuts Woodrow Wilson to ribbons. He says that the other big leaders at the peace conference, Lloyd George of Britain and Clemenceau of France, that Lloyd George had bamboozled Wilson into accepting a very harsh peace for Germany. And later, when Lloyd George wanted to soften the terms, he had found it harder to de-bamboozle the old Presbyterian than it had been to bamboozle him. And Keynes was such a good writer and such a brilliant economist that his opinion is usually taken as gospel. This little business about the bamboozling often gets quoted and less often quoted. He was even more savage about Lloyd George at the peace conference and Clemenceau. But Woodrow Wilson has become the punching bag. And I'm pretty tough on his performance at the peace conference, but I read the minutes of his meetings with, I'm on a Purple Heart for all this stuff I had to do. When you read the minutes, I'm convinced that Wilson was not bamboozled. You can see him in there arguing, sure, very forcefully, very intelligently. He's not giving away anything. What he wanted were strict peace terms, but peace terms that wouldn't be punishing to Germany. And France basically wanted to crush Germany. If there had been nuclear weapons, Clemenceau would have wanted, nuclear bombs dropped all over Germany, I'm sure. But Wilson, his biggest trouble at the peace conference is that he'd always been a poor negotiator. In fact, he detested the idea of negotiation. His idea of how to solve a problem was to think it through, think really hard about it, consider it from every angle he could think of, come up with, here's the best solution to this problem, and then try to talk you members of Congress into accepting it. And for him, negotiation always meant compromise, and compromise meant that the solution that was ultimately going to be accepted would be less than the one that he had come up with. He seemed to think that out of a compromise you might get something that was even better. So just compromise is a negative thing, negotiation. He felt this way from the time he was a young man. He just did not like negotiation. And so he's there and he has to make concessions to the other people, but he never asks for anything in return, which would be like a basic of bargaining, right? Like, if I'm going to pay you extra $1,000 for your house, will you leave me your lawnmower, your sit-down lawnmower? He never asked for anything in return. He didn't even seem to have a list of things that he could draw on for situations like that. And then the other challenge that he faced was the big four were Wilson, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Orlando, who was the Prime Minister of Italy. And they had decided when they started meeting as a foursome that they had to reach unanimous decisions about things, because otherwise the Germans would be able to say, look, you guys didn't even agree on this, why should we go along with it? The Germans, by the way, are not invited to the peace conference. This is going to be a peace that's negotiated entirely by the victors. You know, it would come down to 3 against 1, and after arguing for days and days and days, Wilson just had to give in so they would have unanimity on this issue and could move on to something else. He managed to get the French to scale back certain of their demands, but he was up against this unanimous decision thing, and then the fact that he wasn't a good negotiator. So the treaty is finally signed on June 28, 1919, and he gets on the ocean liner to come back to the United States, and he takes, on July 10th, he takes his copy of the treaty to deposit it with the Senate and, you know, leave them to ratify it. And he was sure they were going to ratify it because the Senate had never failed to ratify a peace treaty ever in the history of the United States. So that's one reason why he was maybe not as concerned as he should have been about opposition, because he thought this was his ace in the hole. The Senate is kind of taking its time and you know, being sort of cranky about many of the terms of the treaty. The treaty's like 260 pages long or something. There's a lot of stuff in there. And he decides he's going to go out on a speaking tour of the United States and talk the people into why it's important to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And the Covenant of the League of Nations is in the Treaty of Versailles, so the two have to be, you know, if you're going to approve the League, you've got to approve the treaty. And if you don't want the United States in the League of Nations, then you don't approve the treaty. So he goes out to give his heartfelt pleas for world order and no more war, and, you know, the League of Nations will take care of things. He's hoping that he will sway these audiences and they will write home, to write back to their senators about this. And he was sick while he was in Paris. Some people don't know, I mean, it's sort of a mystery what he had, and I'll get to this in a little bit, but the answer to what he had might be right here in an attic in Maine, actually. He's out there giving speeches, and oratory was his big gift. You know, he was Obama-like in that way. He could really move audiences. He had trained his voice so that he could project to 10,000 people without any amplification. He doesn't have his oratorical gift anymore. He's just totally exhausted. So he's on his tour. He's about 8,000 miles into this 10,000-mile tour, and he collapsed. So he wanted to go on. He just wanted to rest for a day or so and go on. But his doctor, who was with him on the trip, said, no, we have to go back to Washington. So they go back to Washington, and a week later, he has a major stroke that paralyzes his right side, his whole side. He could still speak, but it's permanently paralyzed. So he's out of the fight. You know, he can't try to work with the Senate to get the treaty passed. That job falls to the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was a good guy and really wanted to have Wilson prevail in this contest. And the Republicans wanted certain concessions, and this Senator Gilbert Hitchcock, got them to kind of narrow them a bit, and through back channels, both the French and the British sent word that if the United States had to pass this treaty with these reservations about what they weren't going to do in the League of Nations, that would be fine with them. They just wanted the United States in the League. But even though Wilson could have had 98% of what he wanted, he decides he's not going to compromise. And he'd always been very stubborn, and some people think it was his stroke that, impaired his thinking. But there was no sign before this that he was ever going to compromise. So I side with the people who think he just had his mind made up. And maybe if he hadn't been sick, he'd be able to talk the Senate into doing it his way. Probably not, especially since the Senate is now in Republican hands. And it isn't that the Republicans always get tarred with being isolationists and in this era. And some of them were, but mostly they had just different ideas about how the United States should be, what its role should be in world affairs. They wanted a smaller role than Wilson, who wanted the United States basically engaged with the whole world. So people are thinking that maybe Wilson should resign because he's paralyzed, and he wouldn't do it. And he wouldn't do it because his vice president, who would succeed him in office, had already said he was in favor of compromises, because the vice president is the president of the Senate. So there's no way Wilson is going to resign. And also one of the doctors, according to Mrs. Wilson, one of the doctors said, oh no, he mustn't resign. He has to have out there, for his recovery, he has to have out there the hope that he'll return to most of his powers and be able to function well as a president again. Otherwise, he could fall into a depression that might kill him. What's going on is the biggest White House cover-up that there had ever been up to that point. I mean, there are all these chipper news bulletins that are given out, oh, Wilson went for a ride in his car today. And what you don't see is that it took two Secret Servicemen, two big burly guys, to lift him into the car. And then he couldn't sit up straight because of being paralyzed on one side, so he's got all these pillows propping him up. There's a picture in my book. This would be a reason to buy my book if you can't think of it. There's a picture of Wilson with a hat on, and you can see his face pretty well. It's after the stroke, and he looks like a haunted man. And it's hard. It's kind of subtle, the difference between the right and left sides of his face, and one side droops a little bit. If you look closely, you can see it. A doctor picks it up right away, but. Anyway, he is a very haunted-looking man, and his doctor is just issuing these bulletins, and two senators who wanted to check this out, was he really still in his right mind, came to visit him, and he could still have a good conversation, and he had a sense of humor when they were there, but what he couldn't do is concentrate, and he couldn't. When your circulatory system isn't working properly, you can't think straight, but you don't know you can't think straight. And I actually had this experience. I mean, I will go to any length for my books, so I don't recommend that you repeat this in your own home. But in the summer of 2014, I was away writing, and I was having a very hard time. Everything was like so hard, and I'm a recovering Catholic. I went to a really strict Catholic school, and so I'm giving myself these sermons about, listen here, Missy, your character is going to hell here. You got to get a grip, And I was even going to the gym. I thought I wasn't getting enough exercise. Well, it turned out my heart was beating at 30 beats a minute. 30 beats a minute, instead of the usual 60 or so. And I needed a pacemaker. But this whole time I'm thinking nothing is wrong except with my character, So it made me understand how Woodrow Wilson, I'm not saying his situation was just like my situation, but I think I can speak to circulatory impairment and thinking. So he's not, thinking straight at all. I think that was a major factor here. And then his doctor is putting out all this cheerful news, and a reporter that Wilson had liked was called in to do a great big two-part feature story that ran in the New York World, which was a very popular paper and was syndicated by other papers. talking about what great shape he was in. And there are so many, I think what happened, the reporter was a good, honest guy, but I think he was so happy to see Wilson up and about. At a certain point he could walk with a cane, and that he just saw things more rosily than he should have. But Wilson's cabinet members, he met with the cabinet a few times after this, and those cabinet members who kept diaries talk about like how kind of out of it he was. His speech was slurred. He had to be introduced to his cabinet members. You know, he had to have someone bring them and say to him to say hello, because he now has like 1/4 of his vision as a result of this stroke. He'd been blind in one eye for a long time. So there's this body of literature on Wilson's health and psychology, and there are some gaps in the evidence, but this business of what did he have when he was in Paris? Some people think he had a stroke, and his doctor said, oh no, it's the flu, and some other people thought it was a respiratory infection. But I was on Maine calling a few weeks ago, and I then got an email from a man who lives in Maine whose grandfather was a doctor at the Paris Peace Conference and saw Wilson many times and kept a diary. And I've actually seen like a short version of his Paris diary, and there's nothing in the short version, but the answer to what Wilson had might well be in that diary. So I'm going to have a chance to look at this pretty soon, so stay tuned. So he's in the White House for 17 months after this stroke. You know, most of the public thinks that he's ailing but still able to function as president. But if you were a cabinet member and you needed a presidential decision on something, what you had to do was write a short memo about it and then phrase everything in a way that could be answered with yes or no. And then Mrs. Wilson would pick what she thought was a good moment on the day when he was feeling right to present him with this question and ask for a decision. So he really should not have been there after that stroke. So, and in 1920, he's still like thinking he's in such good shape that he should be a candidate for a third term. And he has a new Secretary of State, and he's, this is kind of his fair-haired boy, this guy, and so they hatch this secret plot where this guy is going to go to the convention, which is in San Francisco, and they're anticipating a deadlock, at which point this guy will come forward and say, we should nominate Woodrow Wilson, you know? And somehow somebody in San Francisco got wind of that plan, and they made this Secretary of State just step aside and not do this. So Warren G. Harding wins the election of 1920 in a landslide, and Wilson leaves office as a broken man. He's broken politically and physically. But as far as he could tell, he'd made only one mistake in the treaty fight. He thought his timing was wrong, that the treaty was defeated not because of his refusal to compromise, but because the American people were not yet ready for this big role on the world stage. And his hope for the League of Nations was that it would prevent the outbreak of another global war by ridding the world of three of the major causes of First World War: nationalism, militarism, and the alliances that pitted one heavily armed bloc of countries against another. So with the League of Nations, he thought there's only going to be one alliance. We'll have all the countries of the world bound together so they don't have any reason to go to war against each other. And if any member did go rogue and threaten another member of the League, the rest of them were to gang up on them. And the ganging up would be, there would be negotiations first, and if those failed, there would be sanctions, and if those failed, then you'd bring in the troops as a last resort. And on the positive side, the League was going to promote self-government and lower trade barriers and work for disarmament. And it failed. Some people think it failed because the United States didn't join the League, but, and we don't know what would have happened if the United States had joined the League, but in the 1930s, when Hitler and Mussolini are making their first big moves, there's just no will at the League of Nations to or in any other governments to stand up for them. They just kept believing, well, he just wants this, so we'll let him have that, and then things will calm down. But the result was World War II, and for Wilson, the thought was, see, the League of Nations didn't work. So his stock goes down even more. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy all through the Wilson administration, he's watching Wilson very closely, thinking about what's working, what's not working. And he was a committed internationalist, like Wilson. And he thought that Wilson's plan for a new world order could serve as a draft for, that it was a draft, that the Covenant of the League of Nations was a draft worthy of revision. So in 1943, the Allies agreed to establish a new global organization, the UN, and many of the aspirations in the UN Charter were taken straight from the League's covenant. But Roosevelt is also determined to avoid Wilson's mistakes. So from the beginning, he's cultivating bipartisan support for the idea. He and the people he had studying the League decided that the League had been asked to do too many things, that it just, that one organization could not do a good job shouldering all these responsibilities. So he had the idea of creating other organizations to do some of the tasks that had fallen to the League. And this is where we got things like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and NATO. They eventually came out of this experience. And some historians see FDR's version as Wilson 2.0, while others think that FDR tossed Wilson's world order in the wastebasket and started fresh. But my view is that Wilson's failures were instructive. You know, it's good when you want to do something and you can look at what other people have done and why it didn't work. And you might conclude, well, then I couldn't make it work either. Or you might conclude, if only we did this instead, we could make this work. So I think that you could make a case that if that FDR really did benefit from the instruction of Wilson's failures, that he got from Wilson's failures. And I think if he didn't have that, it's quite, you know, if they had completely started from scratch, that the post-war edifice that he designed and that Harry Truman built wouldn't have lasted as long as it has. And right now, that order's under siege, and not simply because of the vocal nationalists in the White House. Nationalism is on the rise around the world. So is dictatorship. And democracy is under attack in some of the most democratic countries on earth, including this one. You know, Brexit kind of undermines Europe's unity in a big way, and we have in Europe and elsewhere the growing popularity of these xenophobic political candidates. In the U.S. too now, that's turning up in this election, the midterms. I think we could say that it's making the world less safe for democracy. You know, some people are wondering if the world really can be made safe for democracy, and some people are wondering if the United States can be made safe for democracy. So that's for all of us to think about and work on in our own ways, but it's just kind of where I come down after thinking about Wilson's legacy and what people have tried to do in foreign affairs. With FDR's revision of Wilson's internationalism now under strain, maybe we need a like FDR 2.0. Because I don't think you have to be a foreign policy genius to see that nationalism isn't the fix. Because local problems have a way of becoming global problems, and global problems need global cooperation and global solutions. So I have a brother who voted for Trump, and when I talk to him about things like this, you know, my brother believes that climate change is a hoax. And I say, well, you know, just keep watching. And So a country can withdraw from a climate accord, but you can't withdraw from climate change, you know. It's going to keep happening. I mean, I'd be so thrilled if I woke up and somebody said, you know what, it's not happening. We see the beginning of a trend in the other direction and everything is just going to be fine. But anyway, the larger thing is that I don't think going it alone is possible in a world where interdependence is the dominant fact of life, and that's where we are. We really are all dependent on each other. And Woodrow Wilson deserves credit, I think, for being the first world leader to recognize that, and the first to bring the governments of the world into an organization that was committed to peace and democracy and free trade and collective response to international aggression. It was a truly revolutionary idea, and it's still the touchstone for big debates on international relations. So the summer of 1918 was the beginning of the end of the World War, and the beginning of the first monumental global effort to bring the governments of the world together to keep peace and meet other global challenges. And as I read the paper and watch the news, I don't know if we're now at the beginning of something or the end of something. And Wilson didn't know either, and neither did FDR. But both of them stepped onto the high road and headed into the wind. And maybe that's what we all need to do. So thank you very much for taking this 100-year walk with me. Not exactly relaxing, I know, but I hope you got a workout in your hearts and minds. And now, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thank you very much.